dark orchestral hum, a slow camera pan across a ruined palace, broken pillars, decaying thrones, and portraits whose painted eyes seem to follow us. There are stories in history that whisper to us from the shadows, stories that linger not in the grand halls of memory, but in the dark corners of forgotten chronicles. And among them is one tale so grim, so grotesque, that it has been retold for centuries as both history and as curse. This is the story of a royal bloodline, born in glory, but doomed to feed upon itself. A dynasty that across generations would destroy the very children it brought into the world. Some say it was politics, others say paranoia, but those who believe in whispers of the supernatural claim it was something far older, a curse woven into the very veins of kings and queens. Sound of a heartbeat begins faintly in the background. They were not ordinary rulers. They stood above their people like living gods, their word stronger than law, their blood treated as sacred, yet beneath the crown's glitter, something foul stirred. The deeper we peer into their past, the more the line between man and monster begins to blur, for in the shadows of their courts, children vanished, heirs were murdered, and families consumed themselves in endless cycles of betrayal. It is said that when a dynasty is cursed, it is not armies or plagues that bring it down, but its own reflection. The first historians who dared to write of this family used words heavy with fear, a house that devours itself. The peasants whispered another phrase, one far more chilling: they feast upon their children, for their hunger is endless. Was this merely a metaphor for power struggles, or something far darker? Did this family, blinded by the crown, literally believe they were bound to consume their heirs in flesh and spirit? Pause. Echo of a child's laughter fades into silence. Legends say the curse began with a mother. Some claim she was betrayed by her husband, a king who stole her throne. With her dying breath, she cursed his descendants, that no child born of his blood would live long enough to inherit peace. Others believe the bargain was darker still, that the family's founding king made a pact with an unseen force, exchanging the lives of future generations for victory in battle. But perhaps the most haunting explanation is also the simplest, that power itself is the curse. For in the pursuit of thrones, bloodlines often devour their own heirs, fearing betrayal where none yet exists. Camera pans to ancient manuscripts, blood-stained marginalia, ominous sketches of monstrous figures devouring infants. As centuries passed, the curse became more than a whisper, it became a pattern. Children who should have ruled vanished before their time. Succession wars tore siblings apart, and rulers, once celebrated as protectors of their people, became predators of their own flesh and blood. The palace, once a beacon of majesty, turned into a prison where no child could sleep safely, and no heir could trust the embrace of a parent. Imagine it being born into gilded halls where every smile may hide a dagger, where every embrace may carry poison, where bedtime lullabies echo in chambers that smell of blood. What would it mean to grow up in a family where love itself is devoured by fear? This is no ordinary history. This is a descent into the darkest corners of royal life, where politics transforms into paranoia, and where the throne becomes a coffin for every child who dares to approach it. Thunder cracks. Transition to darker visuals, flickering candlelight, footsteps echoing in a corridor. In this documentary, we will uncover the dynasty's story piece by piece. We will trace the origins of the curse, watch it spread through generations, and witness the bloodline crumble beneath the weight of its own sins. We will sift through the ruins of history, the chronicles, the folklore, the secrets whispered by those who served in the shadows. And as we do, you must ask yourself, was this family truly cursed by forces beyond human comprehension, or were they the architects of their own damnation? The heartbeat grows louder. The image of a lavish banquet table appears. Plates overflow with food, goblets brimming with wine. But at the center, the seats for children remain empty. The feast has begun, and it will not end until the last heir is consumed. Rolling mist across a battlefield at dawn. The clash of steel echoes faintly. A crown glimmers, half buried in mud. Every dynasty begins with blood, some with victory, others with betrayal. The cursed bloodline we follow was no exception. Long before whispers of curses or devoured heirs, there was a man, or perhaps a monster, who seized a crown in a way that would shape generations. The chronicles tell us that he rose from chaos, a kingdom torn apart by rival claimants, each one spilling rivers of blood in the name of legitimacy. In this storm of violence, one figure carved his way to power, not through divine blessing, but through relentless cruelty. He was not the strongest by lineage, nor the most beloved by the people, but he was feared, and fear has always been a sharper blade than love. Close up on ancient banners fluttering in slow motion, his coronation was not greeted with celebration, but with silence. Some said the heavens themselves refused to bless the ceremony. The sky darkened, a raven perched above the throne, and the newborn heir of a rival family died in its cradle that very night. Coincidence, or the first whisper of the curse? But power, once grasped, must be secured. This founding king knew it well. He married not for love, but for alliance, binding noble houses with the false promises of prosperity. Yet behind palace walls, the air was heavy with suspicion. Every ally was a rival in waiting. Every child born carried not hope, but threat. The first children of this dynasty, those who should have been symbols of continuity, instead became pawns. Some were wedded off as bargaining chips. Others disappeared entirely, vanishing into monasteries, prisons, or shallow graves. The royal nursery, which should have been filled with laughter, became a place of whispers and locked doors. Soft choral voices rise in the background, echoing like a prayer turning sour. Even the church, that eternal guardian of kingship, looked upon this new bloodline with unease. Priests wrote of unnatural hungers in their private letters, of a ruler who paced his halls at night, muttering of shadows that demanded sacrifice. Some believed he made a bargain, victory in exchange for blood. The peasants outside the palace believed something simpler, that the family had been marked. They told stories of a witch, spurned by the founding king, who cursed him with her final breath. Your sons shall not inherit your throne. They shall be consumed as you consumed me. At first such whispers were dismissed as peasant gossip, but the pattern began quickly. The king's firstborn son, a boy destined to inherit the throne, was dead before he reached manhood. Official records called it a fever, yet servants spoke of screams in the night, of the prince's face twisted as if in terror before the end. Another child disappeared during a hunt. His horse returned riderless, its saddle drenched in blood, though no body was ever found. And so, with each generation, the shadow grew longer. Camera pans slowly across portraits of stern-faced royals, their painted eyes cold and lifeless. But we must not forget, for the people, this was still a dynasty of power. The family's armies won wars. Their coffers overflowed, their palaces glittered with gold. To outsiders, they appeared blessed. But inside, the halls grew silent. The laughter of children, the promise of tomorrow, rarely survived to echo for long. One chronicler, a man later executed for treason, dared to write the truth in the margins of his manuscript. They are cursed, and the curse is this, that they must feast on their own flesh to keep the crown. For every child born is a meal already promised. Here lies the paradox of this dynasty's birth. In conquering the throne, they won only chains. Chains forged from blood, from superstition, from the relentless fear of being replaced. And as years turned to decades, the curse became not just legend, but expectation. Heirs were raised with fear in their eyes, aware that their survival was uncertain, their future fragile. Parents gazed upon their children, not with warmth, but with calculation. The cradle was not a sanctuary, but a dangerous chessboard. Visual, a banquet hall filling with shadows, the laughter of courtiers fading into silence. The dynasty had been born in violence, and in that violent birth, it carried the seed of its destruction. From the moment the crown was seized, the bloodline was already doomed to devour itself. But this was only the beginning. Camera pulls back to reveal a vast family tree etched into stone. Branches snap and crumble one by one, until only a few remain dripping with crimson. The curse had taken root, and in the next generation, it would reveal itself in ways even darker, even more horrifying than anyone could have foreseen. A cradle rocking in a dimly lit chamber, the sound of wind pressing against the shutters, A candle flickers, casting shadows like grasping fingers across the walls. Every curse has a beginning, and for this bloodline, the first true omen came in the form of a single child. A child born into silk and gold, yet destined for silence before his voice ever reached manhood. The chronicles record the death plainly, almost coldly. The young prince, first of his line, succumbed to an illness most sudden. But history has a way of softening horror into words. The truth, preserved in whispers, is far more unsettling. Servants spoke of the child's strange birth, of how the midwife claimed the infant's cry sounded more like a scream, sharp and piercing enough to rattle the rafters. Some said the queen herself fell into convulsions as soon as the child touched her breast, muttering the words, "Take him away before he takes me." For a time the boy grew, as all children do. He learned to walk across marble floors, his small footsteps echoing in chambers lined with tapestries of his ancestors. But with each passing season, unease surrounded him. Nurses claimed he woke screaming from nightmares, clutching his throat. Guards swore they heard him whispering to empty corners of the room, as though someone invisible rocked him to sleep. Visual. A black bird perched on the palace roof, wings twitching restlessly. The first sign of doom came one stormy night. The queen dreamt of blood pouring from her crown, filling the cradle until the baby disappeared beneath it. She woke in terror, demanding the priests bless the child. They came with incense and holy water, but when the drops touched his skin, the infant shrieked as if burned. 3 nights later, the child was gone. The official tale, written carefully into the annals, speaks of fever, that the child's body weakened, his face grew pale, and he slipped away in his sleep. It was, they said, the will of heaven, but those who saw his body told a different story. A handmaiden, who prepared his final garments, swore his tiny lips were stained crimson, as though he had bitten his own tongue in terror. A guard whispered that the child's eyes, wide open in death, were glazed not with peace, but with fear. And strangest of all, the cradle itself bore scratches, claw marks gouged deep into the wood, though no animal had entered the chamber. Camera drifts through the empty nursery, toys scattered, the cradle swaying on its own. The kingdom mourned as kingdoms do, with processions and prayers, yet beneath the solemn rituals, dread was spreading. The people began to whisper that the child was not taken by fever, but by the curse, that he had been the first meal promised, the first life devoured by the bloodline's hunger. Stories multiplied. Some said a shadowy figure had been seen standing by the cradle in the moments before his death, vanishing when the door opened. Others claimed the king himself had ordered the boy's silence, fearing prophecy that his son would grow strong enough to overthrow him. Whatever the truth, the impact was undeniable. This first death was the moment the curse was no longer just whispered in taverns or muttered by midwives. It became real. The dynasty's children were no longer symbols of hope. They were potential victims, marked by fate. The court grew restless. Nobles hesitated to send their daughters into the family, fearing their blood would be poisoned by the curse. Priests performed endless rituals, sprinkling holy water, burning incense, locking relics into the nursery rooms, but no ritual could banish the dread. Low drumbeat rises as the camera cuts to peasants gathered outside the palace gates. In the villages, the tale took on a life of its own. Mothers warned their children not to wander after dark, lest the cursed prince, hungry even in death, come seeking playmates. Songs were sung of the child of midnight, whose cry could call death into any home. The curse once contained within palace walls, now spilled into the imagination of the people. And within the palace itself, something darker was growing. The king, already paranoid, became consumed with fear of his remaining children. If one son could be taken, what of the others? Some chronicles suggest he forbade them from sleeping in the same room, keeping them apart as though to prevent the curse from spreading. Others write of his growing distance from them, how he would not hold them, nor look upon them, as though every embrace might invite betrayal or death. Thus the curse achieved its first triumph. It had not only stolen a child, but had poisoned the very bond between parent and heir. Camera closes in on the cradle once more. Dust now covers it, Cobwebs stretch across its wooden frame. A faint echo of a baby's cry lingers in the air before fading into silence. The dynasty was shaken, its foundation cracked, and though the court tried to bury the truth beneath layers of ritual, ceremony, and denial, the memory of that lost child lingered. For it was not just a death. It was a warning, the first blood payment in a debt that would stretch across centuries, and the bloodline, blinded by crowns and cloaks of gold, had only begun to pay. A torchlit corridor stretches endlessly. The camera glides forward. Footsteps echo, hurried, cautious, as though someone follows but never appears. Every palace has its secrets, but in this dynasty, secrets were not ornaments of intrigue. They were weapons. Behind gilded doors, beneath painted ceilings, the walls themselves seemed to listen, storing every whispered plot and every hushed prayer, and soon those whispers turned into screams. The death of the first child had shaken the kingdom, but it was not only grief that haunted the palace. It was fear. The curse was no longer an abstract tale. It had become a presence, stalking the corridors, a shadow that touched every decision the royal family made. The king, desperate to protect his throne, began to see betrayal everywhere. Every smile from his courtiers seemed to conceal a dagger. Every glance from his children seemed a plot in waiting. Close up, a banquet hall. Gold plates gleam, but no one eats. The air hangs heavy with suspicion. Royal families throughout history have feared their heirs, but in this dynasty fear became obsession. Sons were no longer nurtured. They were monitored. Daughters were no longer celebrated. They were bartered away as pawns. The king's council warned him of rival houses gathering strength. But rather than focus outward, his gaze turned inward. He began to believe the greatest threat to his rule came not from enemies at his gates, but from his own blood. The chronicles tell us of the first great purge, a son, barely grown, accused of conspiring with foreign powers. Evidence was thin, but the accusation was enough. The boy was dragged from his chambers, tried in secret, and executed. His body was never buried in consecrated ground. Another child was locked away in a monastery, forbidden to leave its walls. Officially, it was for his education. In truth, it was a prison without chains. And then there were the daughters, married hastily, sent to distant lands, their voices erased from court. One was found drowned in a river, her death declared an accident. Few believed it. Visual, a servant scrubbing blood from marble steps. The sound of distant weeping echoes faintly. From this moment forward, the curse took on a new shape. No longer just whispers of supernatural doom, it became political reality. The dynasty was devouring its children, not only in myth, but in cold, deliberate acts of paranoia. Every generation after would inherit this sickness, a dynasty so terrified of its heirs that it destroyed them before they could inherit the throne. The palace itself seemed to become alive with fear. Servants told stories of doors opening by themselves, of voices carried down empty corridors. Children left toys in one chamber, only to find them arranged differently the next morning, as though unseen hands had played with them in the night. And within this haunting atmosphere, trust became impossible. Brothers spied on brothers. Sisters whispered to priests, trading family secrets for protection. The court became a nest of serpents, each ready to strike the moment weakness was shown. Camera slowly reveals a tapestry of the royal family tree, but the faces of many heirs are stitched over with black thread, erased. Some chroniclers dared to call it what it was, cannibalism of the spirit. A bloodline that could not bear to nurture its young. Instead it consumed them in fear, suspicion, and violence. And yet, outwardly, the dynasty thrived. Wars were won, palaces expanded. To the outside world, the rulers seemed untouchable, but behind their jeweled crowns, paranoia hollowed them from within. One particularly chilling account describes a royal feast. A young heir, celebrated for his beauty and promise, sat beside his father. Courtiers raised their goblets, praising the boy's future. Yet before the night ended, the heir collapsed, poisoned. His father never lifted a hand to save him. Instead, he ordered the musicians to continue playing. The banquet became a funeral in all but name. This story spread like wildfire through the kingdom. To the people, it was proof. The family was cursed not by chance, but by its own hunger. They devoured their heirs to keep power. Low strings rise. The camera pans across a series of locked doors in the palace, each with iron bars across them. Fear trickled downward. Nobles began to fear their own households. Families copied the royal model, keeping children under guard, silencing them before they could become rivals. The dynasty's curse was not contained. It infected the culture of power itself, and within the palace, the whispers never ceased. Rumors of infants smothered at birth to prevent succession disputes, tales of mothers slipping poison into their children's cups, dreams of shadows looming over cradles, whispering promises of death. One letter, smuggled out by a terrified tutor, describes the atmosphere best. The palace is not a home, it is a tomb where the living walk. The children here are born already buried. Their smiles fade before they bloom, for they are watched as one watches enemies. The king devours them not with teeth, but with suspicion. By now, the dynasty was locked in a cycle. Each king feared his sons. Each mother wept for daughters lost to exile or accident. Each heir carried not hope, but dread. The curse had ceased to be merely supernatural. It had become a way of ruling, and with every act of violence, the dynasty's foundations grew weaker, for no throne can survive forever if it devours its future before the future arrives. Camera pulls back to a panoramic view of the palace at night. Dozens of windows glow with candlelight, yet none show figures within, only shadows moving against the curtains, restless and inhuman. The whispers in the halls were growing louder, no longer the cautious murmurs of courtiers, but something darker, voices that could not be silenced, patterns of betrayal that could not be broken. And as each generation repeated the same sins, the dynasty's fate became sealed. The curse had taken hold, not just of their blood, but of their minds. A heavy storm brews above the palace. Lightning flashes, illuminating gargoyle-like statues. The sound of distant chanting echoes faintly. By now, the dynasty was already marked by tragedy. Children gone too soon, heirs erased before their time. Yet what began as suspicion soon hardened into something greater. The curse was no longer just a whisper. It was given a shape, a face, a voice, in the minds of those who lived under its shadow. The people had always told stories, but now their tales began to crystallize into legend. They said the bloodline had been struck by a judgment older than kingship itself. Some claimed the founding ruler had made a bargain with a spirit of the underworld, offering the lives of his children in exchange for victory. Others believed a spurned queen, betrayed and left to die, had cast her vengeance upon the wombs of all future mothers in the dynasty. Each version differed, yet the heart of every tale was the same. The bloodline was cursed to devour its own. Close up, an old cracked manuscript. Its ink is smudged with what looks like dried blood. Margins filled with frantic drawings, crowns dripping, skeletal figures holding infants. Folklore painted gruesome pictures. Peasants whispered of ghostly women wandering the palace halls at night, cradling invisible children, their lullabies sour with grief. Others told of phantom banquets, where empty chairs meant for heirs were occupied by shadows that feasted in silence. The most chilling tale came from servants who claimed to see the same figure, a woman cloaked in black, face veiled, lingering by the nursery doors. She would vanish before dawn, leaving only the faint smell of burning wax and the echo of a child's cry. And within the palace, belief in the curse began to harden. The king, paranoid, ordered priests and mystics to perform rituals to cleanse the bloodline. Incense burned day and night, holy water sprinkled on every cradle, talismans hung from the necks of infants. But still, the deaths came, and with each passing tragedy, the explanation shifted from politics to the supernatural. Visual, a circle of priests chanting in candlelight, the king watching with hollow eyes. the queen clutching her child tightly, as if the ritual itself might snatch it away. Some claimed the curse was a hunger, a bloodthirst that dwelled within the royal veins, that every ruler, no matter how virtuous, carried within them the seed of destruction. Others believed the palace itself was haunted, a place where time twisted, where the walls absorbed every cry and every death, replaying them endlessly. Whatever the cause, the effect was the same terror, not just in the peasants' villages, but in the highest chambers of power. The dynasty began to see omens everywhere. A bird dying on the palace steps was seen as a sign. Another heir would soon follow. A dream of red water foretold the spilling of royal blood. Even the smallest cough from a child was enough to send priests rushing with relics and chants. Mothers grew frantic. Some clung desperately to their children, shielding them against shadows real or imagined. Others in despair turned against their offspring, convinced the only way to protect the throne was to rid themselves of the cursed seed. Visual, a mother rocking her child in the dark. Her face is streaked with tears. Behind her a figure looms, faceless, watching. One queen became infamous for her nightly vigils. She was said to stay awake for days, clutching her infant, terrified that if she closed her eyes even for a moment, the curse would claim him. When he finally died, the queen wandered the palace halls for years, whispering lullabies to empty air, convinced her son's spirit still lingered. Another queen, darker in nature, was accused of killing her own daughter with poison, claiming it was a mercy before the curse could take her. Whether truth or rumor, the tale spread, adding to the sense that no royal child was safe, not from illness, not from assassins, and not even from their mothers. As the legend grew, so too did its reach. Poets wove the curse into verse, singers turned it into dirges, and common folk repeated it as cautionary tales. Children were warned not to disobey, or the cursed king would come and feast upon you. The dynasty had become more than rulers. They had become a story of horror, repeated from mouth to mouth, each telling darker than the last. Visual, a feast table stretches into darkness, plates are filled, goblets raised, but as the camera pans across, we see the guests as shadows, their jaws opening wide, dripping red as they consume invisible flesh. Inside the palace, the fear of the curse became prophecy. Fathers struck down sons before they could rebel. Sons conspired against their fathers, convinced survival meant seizing power early. Every death fed the legend, and every legend fed the deaths. The curse had taken form not only in myth, but in the minds of the family itself. It no longer mattered if the curse was real or imagined. By believing in it, they ensured its power. One chronicler described it simply: they became what they feared. In dreading the curse, they created it. In avoiding it, they fulfilled it. Camera slowly zooms in on the throne, empty, draped in shadows. The sound of faint whispers fills the air, overlapping voices, indistinct but urgent. This was the moment the curse stopped being a tale of peasants and became the reality of kings. The dynasty was no longer a family, it was a feast where the only nourishment was betrayal, suspicion, and blood, and with every generation that passed, the hunger only deepened. Under the vaulted ceilings of the great hall, where golden chandeliers once sparkled with the promise of opulence, shadows lengthened, and whispers of betrayal clung to the stone walls like mildew. It was here that the dynasty's most grotesque ritual played out, not as a single event but as a recurring cycle that spanned generations. History recorded it politely as succession crises, but the truth was far uglier. Each banquet, each gathering of the bloodline became less about celebration and more about survival. The curse had turned the dining table into a battlefield, where poison traveled faster than swords, and a single sip of wine could determine the fate of a kingdom. The banquet was both literal and symbolic. Courtiers would gather, toasting the health of princes and kings, yet their eyes darted nervously to the goblets placed before them. Some accounts describe noble guests refusing to eat, fearing their food had been tainted. Others tell of children bursting into sudden violent illness mid-feast, their tiny bodies convulsing while musicians continued to play, instructed not to stop lest panic spread. The sound of violins, it was said, often drowned out the last cries of young heirs, and all the while, the royal family sat frozen, uncertain whether to comfort the fallen child or protect themselves from invisible hands reaching through the curse. But the banquet was more than food. It was a feast of betrayal. Brothers plotted against brothers, sisters whispered into the ears of kings, and mothers encouraged their sons to act before being devoured by the family itself. A young prince, once celebrated for his promise, was found dead in his chamber after such a gathering, his lips stained red, his body rigid as though seized by invisible hands. Official records noted illness, but commoners spoke differently, that he had been consumed, not by disease but by a bloodline that demanded sacrifice. The banquet was never-ending, each generation a course in a meal that had no conclusion. The legend of the banquet grew in the retelling. Some swore that the hall itself was cursed, that beneath the marble floor lay the bones of children buried secretly by queens desperate to conceal their shame. Others believed that each spilled goblet of wine was not wine at all, but the blood of those who had fallen before. Servants whispered that they sometimes heard laughter in the empty dining chamber at night, not the laughter of joy, but the brittle, cruel laughter of ghosts who relished the endless feast. Those who dared speak of it said that once you dined at the royal table, you were already marked, already swallowed by the curse. One chronicler described a banquet that turned into a massacre. The king, already paranoid that his sons would conspire against him, invited them all to a feast under the guise of reconciliation. Musicians played loudly, servants poured wine endlessly, and torches burned until the room sweltered. At the height of the feast, the king rose, cup in hand, and toasted the health of his heirs. Moments later, the sons clutched their throats, gasping for air. Some collapsed instantly, others staggered toward the doors, but none escaped. By dawn, the hall was silent save for the crackle of torches and the sound of the king drinking alone. Whether truth or exaggeration, the tale was repeated for centuries, each retelling darker than the last, a reminder that the banquet was not just rumor, it was ritual. This pattern of betrayal seeped into every corner of the dynasty's life. The curse ensured that no heir could truly trust another, that no celebration was pure. Weddings became moments of dread, baptisms tinged with fear, even coronations haunted by the question of who would be devoured next. It was said that the crown itself carried a taste of blood, as if every jewel embedded in its frame held the essence of those lost. The banquet was no longer confined to the great hall, it followed them into their bedrooms, their dreams, their very souls. For the people outside the palace walls, these stories became symbols of both terror and fascination. The dynasty was seen as cursed gluttons, consuming their children, their kin, their legacy. Folklore claimed that each full moon, the royal family gathered for a secret feast where they devoured not food, but pieces of their own lineage. Children disappeared from villages near the palace, and parents whispered that the royals had taken them to sat the hunger of their curse. Whether truth or myth, the stories carried weight, deepening the dynasty's isolation, turning their feasts into infamous symbols of doom. The banquet also became psychological. Princes grew up knowing their brothers were rivals, not allies. Daughters were married off, not in celebration, but to remove them from the cycle before they could be devoured. Each gesture of kindness was scrutinized, every smile suspected. The dynasty had devoured itself so completely that even love became another form of betrayal. In one infamous tale, a mother prepared a meal with her own hands for her son, swearing it was safe. Hours later he was dead, and she was left alone in her chamber, wailing that the curse had forced her hand. History recorded it as madness. The people whispered it was the banquet claiming another course. The horror of the banquet lay not only in death, but in inevitability. Every generation believed they could escape, that rituals or alliances might break the cycle. Yet every time they gathered under candlelight, every time goblets clinked in hollow celebration, the outcome was the same. Another heir gone, another line severed, another story of betrayal added to the legend. The dynasty had turned its most sacred space of family unity into a slaughterhouse disguised as a dining hall, and so the banquet of betrayals became the defining ritual of the cursed bloodline. More than battlefields, more than politics, it was here, at the table, that the family devoured itself. In goblets of poisoned wine, in dishes served with false smiles, in shadows cast by chandeliers dripping wax like blood, the curse was renewed again and again. No feast was safe, no heir untouched. The dynasty had become a predator that fed upon itself, and the banquet was its altar. The palace stood as a monument of stone and silence, its corridors winding like veins through a body already half dead. To outsiders, it gleamed with wealth, a fortress of marble and gold. But for those within, it was a prison that breathed, groaned, and whispered. Servants told of strange murmurs in the dead of night, voices that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. These whispers carried no clear words at first, only sounds like sighs, like the soft hum of lullabies twisted out of tune. Yet the longer one listened, the more they seemed to take shape, echoing the names of those already lost, or warning of deaths yet to come. Generations grew up in these halls, and each swore the walls remembered. Footsteps rang where no one walked. The sound of a child's laughter drifted through locked doors. Even the tapestries seemed alive, shifting as though trying to escape the stories they depicted. Chroniclers wrote of the architecture being cursed from its foundation. Legend claimed that the stones themselves had been taken from a battlefield soaked in blood, carried into the palace by men who died one by one before the walls were even complete. Whether true or not, the belief persisted that the palace had swallowed its history and continued to feed upon it. For the royal children, the whispers became companions and tormentors alike. Lonely princes lying awake in bed claimed to hear soft voices coaxing them to come closer, to follow down shadowed corridors. Some obeyed, never to return, their disappearance written off as kidnappings or accidents. Others refused, yet were found dead in their chambers, as if the walls had reached in to claim them. One particularly grim tale described a boy prince who pressed his ear against a wall to hear the murmurs better, only for blood to seep from the stone and stain his face. He was dead within the week, his nurse swearing that he had been marked. The whispers fed paranoia among the adults as well. Queens accused their rivals of sending spirits through the walls to torment their children. Kings ordered entire chambers sealed when too many strange voices echoed within. Yet no matter how many doors were bricked up, no matter how many tapestries torn down, the voices always found another path. They slithered through cracks, traveled down corridors, and even rose from beneath the marble floors. Ministers claimed to hear their own secrets repeated back to them late at night. Soldiers stationed in the palace guardroom fled, muttering about voices that mocked their thoughts. It was not only voices. At night, the palace was alive with more than whispers. Candle flames guttered and died in sudden drafts. Doors opened themselves, revealing empty rooms that smelled of decay. Courtiers reported the sensation of being watched, their shoulders chilled as if unseen eyes followed them from shadow to shadow. The walls creaked and groaned like a body shifting in its sleep. To some, the palace was more than cursed. It was a predator, slowly consuming everyone within, beginning with the most vulnerable. Stories spread of a secret passageway deep within the palace where the whispers were loudest. Servants claimed that those who entered heard the voices clearly, as though the walls themselves were speaking directly to them. Some emerged raving, tearing at their ears, crying that the palace had demanded blood. Others never emerged at all, the passage sealed behind them, as if the palace itself had chosen to keep them. The royals, desperate to control the narrative, banned anyone from exploring those halls. But the ban only deepened the allure, and the whispers continued to spread like a disease through rumor and fear. The dynasty began to interpret the whispers as messages from the curse itself. Some kings believed they were warnings, omens meant to guide the throne away from destruction. Others believed they were temptations, urging betrayal, feeding suspicion. One queen famously confessed that the whispers had told her which of her children would live and which would die, And when she was proven right, her sanity unraveled completely. She spent her final days pressing her hands to the walls, begging them to reveal how she might undo the curse. When she died, the walls of her chamber reportedly bled through the plaster, an image that haunted the servants for decades. Commoners, forbidden to enter the palace, spun their own stories from the rumors. They claimed the whispers were the voices of the devoured children, trapped for eternity inside the stone. They said the palace itself was a tomb, feeding off the life of the dynasty, ensuring no child could ever escape its hunger. Priests, when summoned, declared the structure possessed, its foundation crawling with demons. Exorcisms were attempted, incense burned, psalms read in every chamber, but each attempt only seemed to make the whispers louder, more mocking, as though laughing at mortal attempts to silence them. The terror of the whispers was not only supernatural but psychological. The family, already fractured by suspicion, began to unravel completely under the weight of unseen voices. Fathers mistrusted sons who claimed to hear warnings, dismissing them as lies. Mothers clung to daughters who whispered in their sleep, convinced the walls had chosen them next. Ministers plotted in silence, only to hear their secrets echoed back from empty corridors. The curse no longer needed poisons or daggers to destroy the dynasty. It needed only the voices that crept through stone, eroding sanity, gnawing away at trust, until betrayal became inevitable. And so the whispers became more feared than assassins, more dreaded than open rebellion, for at least an assassin's blade was visible, a rebellion tangible. But the whispers, they were everywhere and nowhere. They turned even silence into a weapon, so that no one could rest without fearing what the walls might say next. In the end, the dynasty was not merely cursed to devour its children with actions, it was cursed to listen forever, to the echo of its own ruin carried through stone, until every heir, every parent, every king and queen came to understand that the palace itself had become both cradle and grave, womb and tomb, a place where whispers never ended. She was a queen, unlike any other, remembered less for her rule than for the dreadful ritual she embraced in her final years. To outsiders, she appeared regal, draped in jewels, her crown heavy with the weight of empire. Yet behind the palace walls, her nights were not spent in silken beds, but in something far stranger, something that would cement her legend as both madwoman and martyr. She chose to sleep inside a coffin, a habit so macabre that even her closest attendants shuddered to speak of it. Why would a queen, blessed with wealth and power, abandon comfort for the cold embrace of a coffin? The answer lay not only in grief, but in the curse that had haunted her family for generations. Her story began as one of promise. Married young to a powerful king, she was expected to bear heirs who would secure the dynasty's future. She gave birth to children, but one by one they slipped away, taken by sudden illness, strange accidents, or mysterious circumstances no one dared explain. Each death left her hollowed, until even her beauty, once praised in poetry, seemed etched with shadows. Courtiers whispered that the curse had claimed her womb, that her children were never meant to survive. She herself began to believe it. As grief consumed her, she turned to rituals both sacred and profane, searching for any way to appease the unseen force that had devoured her offspring. One night, it was said, she dreamed of her children calling to her from the other side. In the dream, they lay in coffins, reaching out their tiny hands, begging her to join them. When she awoke, she ordered a coffin to be brought to her chambers. At first, she claimed it was symbolic, a reminder of mortality, a way to commune with her lost children. But soon the symbolism gave way to practice. Each night she climbed inside, lay still, and closed the lid above her. Servants who guarded the door swore they heard her whispering lullabies into the dark, as though soothing infants who were not there. By dawn she would emerge pale, shaken, yet strangely serene, as if she had walked the line between life and death, and returned with secrets. The court was horrified. Ministers pleaded with her to stop, fearing her nightly ritual was feeding the legend of the curse. Priests declared it sacrilege, a queen desecrating herself with funerary practices while still alive. But the queen refused to listen. To her, the coffin was not desecration, it was sanctuary. She believed that by sleeping among the dead, she could protect herself from the curse's hunger, disguising herself as one already claimed. The coffin, she said, was not her prison but her shield. As word spread beyond the palace, her ritual became the subject of fascination and dread. Commoners whispered that their queen was half dead already, her soul trapped between this world and the next. Some claimed her nightly sleep allowed her to speak with the spirits of the devoured heirs, to learn their fates and hear their warnings. Others believed she had bargained with death itself, offering her own body to spare future generations. Whatever the truth, her legend grew, and the image of the coffin queen became inseparable from the cursed bloodline. The queen's obsession deepened. She had her coffin lined with velvet and inscribed with symbols drawn from both scripture and forbidden texts. She demanded candles burn at all hours in her chamber, their wax dripping endlessly like tears onto the stone floor. Sometimes she refused to leave the coffin even during the day, conducting audiences with ministers from within its narrow confines. Her voice, muffled by the lid, gave the impression of a voice speaking from a tomb, chilling even the most hardened courtiers. One account described a visiting ambassador nearly fainting when the coffin creaked open mid-meeting, and the pale queen emerged, as if resurrected before his eyes. Her husband, the king, grew distant, torn between pity and revulsion. Some say he avoided her chambers entirely, unable to bear the sight of her nightly descent into death. Others claim he supported her, convinced her ritual might indeed placate the curse. Whatever his stance, the queen's isolation only worsened, until she was more ghost than monarch. The people began to say the palace had two rulers, the king upon the throne and the queen within her coffin, one governing the living and the other communing with the dead. Her ritual became the subject of poetry, art, and horror. Minstrels sang of the coffin queen who sought her children beneath the veil. Painters depicted her pale form rising from the coffin, hands outstretched toward phantom infants. Even enemies of the dynasty whispered her story, using it as proof that the bloodline was not merely cursed but rotting from within, their rulers surrendering to madness. Yet for all the scorn and fear, her legend carried a strange, terrible dignity. In her coffin she defied the curse by embracing it, transforming her grief into a ritual that blurred the line between devotion and despair. In the final years of her life, the coffin queen grew frailer, her body wasting away as though she truly belonged more to the grave than to the world of the living. Servants reported that sometimes, when they opened the lid at dawn, she did not stir immediately. They had to shake her, fearing each time that she had finally crossed the threshold for good. One morning she did not wake at all. She was found lying with a faint smile, her hands clasped over her chest, as though she had finally been reunited with the children she had lost. Her death left an eerie silence in the palace. Some believed her ritual had drawn the curse deeper into the bloodline, binding it tighter than ever. Others whispered that in death she had carried it away with her, leaving behind a fragile hope for those who remained. But the image of the queen who slept in a coffin lingered, carved into memory as both tragedy and warning. Her chamber was sealed, her coffin left untouched, and generations later, when the room was reopened, the air was said to reek of melted wax and roses, as if her presence had never left. To this day her legend persists. Folklorists debate whether she was a victim of madness or a visionary who sought communion with the dead. Paranormal storytellers claim her spirit still roams the palace halls, returning each night to her coffin, repeating the ritual that defined her reign. Whatever the interpretation, she remains the most haunting symbol of the cursed bloodline, a mother so broken by grief, so consumed by fear, that she chose to live as though already dead. In doing so she gave her dynasty its most chilling image, the queen who lay among the dead to escape the fate of the living. The children born into the cursed bloodline were not seen as blessings but as omens. From the moment they drew their first breath, a cloud of dread settled over the palace. Midwives whispered prayers as they wrapped the infants in silk, knowing the likelihood of survival was slim. Some babies died before their names were ever spoken, their tiny bodies buried in secret as though the dynasty wished to erase even the memory of their existence. Others survived long enough to walk and speak, only to vanish suddenly, their deaths explained with vague phrases like a fever took them or a tragic fall. Yet behind these excuses lay a darker truth. Many believed the children were consumed by the curse itself, claimed as offerings before they could inherit power. For the children who did survive, life was no kinder. They grew up in an atmosphere of constant suspicion, where every meal could be poisoned, every embrace a potential betrayal. Their parents, haunted by the fear of losing them, oscillated between suffocating love and cold distance. Some mothers locked their children in guarded chambers, refusing to let them play outdoors, convinced the curse would snatch them the moment they stepped into sunlight. Others, broken by grief, treated their offspring not as children, but as sacrifices in waiting, never daring to bond too deeply. The children became shadows within the palace, raised in silence, their laughter stifled, their joy smothered by the weight of expectation and dread. Whispers grew around these young heirs. Servants claimed that some of them were different, marked by the curse from birth. A prince born with eyes as black as coal, a princess whose cries sounded like screams in the night, a child who never spoke yet, stared at the walls as though listening to voices no one else could hear. These tales blurred the line between truth and folklore, but they spread quickly, adding to the terror that surrounded the dynasty. It was said that the curse not only claimed the children, but reshaped them, twisting their innocence into something unnatural. Among the most infamous stories was that of twin brothers, born healthy and strong, who grew inseparable in childhood. Yet as they reached their teenage years, strange occurrences followed them. Animals fled their presence, mirrors cracked without reason, and servants swore they heard two voices whispering in unison, even when the boys were silent. Fearing their bond was a sign of the curse's hunger, their father ordered them separated. Within a year, one twin was dead under mysterious circumstances, and the other, consumed by grief and rage, turned violent, attacking his own tutors before vanishing from the palace. Legends claim he was later seen wandering the countryside, half mad, insisting his brother's spirit spoke through him. Another tale spoke of a young princess who spent her days drawing disturbing images, figures with hollow eyes, cribs filled with bones, banquet tables surrounded by faceless guests. When questioned, she claimed the whispering children showed her what to draw. Though dismissed as childish imagination, her drawings mirrored tragedies that later unfolded in the family. She died before reaching adulthood, her sketches burned by courtiers who feared they were proof of the curse's influence. Yet copies survived, passed secretly among the people as forbidden relics of prophecy. The children's suffering extended beyond superstition. With so many heirs lost, surviving ones became pawns in endless struggles for succession. Older siblings viewed younger ones as rivals, while uncles and cousins schemed to place their own offspring closer to the throne. The atmosphere of fear bred paranoia within the children themselves. Some refused food for days, terrified it was poisoned. Others locked themselves in chambers, scrawling prayers on the walls in blood from their own hands. Childhood was devoured by terror. Innocence was a luxury. The curse allowed no one to keep. For the dynasty, these broken heirs symbolized both hope and doom. Each birth was greeted with desperate optimism, each death with weary resignation. The people outside the palace watched with fascination, their own folklore shaped by the tales of cursed children. Parents warned disobedient sons and daughters, "Behave or the Shadow Prince will come for you." Nurses frightened infants into silence by invoking the names of royal children who had gone missing. In villages, dolls were crafted to resemble pale-faced princes and princesses, left on doorsteps as warnings that the curse's reach extended beyond the palace gates. The rare children who reached adulthood often bore scars no crown could hide. Some grew ruthless, convinced survival required cruelty. Others became reclusive, haunted by the ghosts of siblings they barely remembered. A few turned to the occult, seeking to break the curse through forbidden rites, only to spiral deeper into madness. One heir, determined to outwit fate, executed every cousin who might challenge his claim, only to die childless, leaving the dynasty weaker than ever. His reign became a grim lesson. Even those who lived long enough to wear the crown could not escape the shadow of the curse. In the end, the children of the bloodline were less heirs than offerings. Their short lives fed the legend, their deaths feeding the dynasty's fear. They were ghosts before they ever had a chance to grow, shadows cast long before their time. And as each generation passed, the people came to believe the curse demanded not only the children's lives but their innocence, their joy, their very humanity. They were born into a family already devouring itself, and from the moment they opened their eyes, the question was not if the curse would take them but when. There were always whispers that the curse did not come from nowhere, that it was not chance or divine punishment, but the result of a deliberate act, an unholy pact struck in desperation at the dynasty's birth. Historians who dig through half-burned manuscripts and forbidden chronicles speak of a night long forgotten, when the founding king pressed to secure his throne against overwhelming enemies, sought power beyond the reach of men. He turned not to priests, but to shadowed figures who lingered at the edges of belief, sorcerers, seers, and beings whose very names were erased from official record. What bargain was struck? No one could say with certainty. Some claimed he offered his soul, others claimed he promised a generation of heirs. Yet the most enduring story held that he bound his entire bloodline, offering the children of his dynasty as collateral for a kingdom forged in blood. The ritual, according to rumor, took place not in a temple, but in a cavern beneath the palace grounds, a place where the earth itself seemed to pulse with unnatural energy. There, by torchlight, the king cut his palm and let the blood drip onto stone said to be older than the world of men. Witnesses spoke of voices rising from the darkness, a chorus of hunger, demanding more than one man's sacrifice. The king agreed, and in that moment, the pact was sealed. Victory followed swiftly after. His enemies fell, his crown secured. But the cost, though invisible at first, began to reveal itself in the next generation, when children began to wither like flowers cut too soon. Whether true or not, this tale persisted, carried in secret by those who dared to write of it. The dynasty, desperate to erase such rumors, burned manuscripts and executed those accused of witchcraft. Yet the stories endured, for no fire could destroy what the people already whispered to one another in the dark. If the pact had truly been made, then it explained everything: the endless cycle of devoured heirs, the madness that seeped through the bloodline, the palace alive with voices. The dynasty was not merely cursed, it was bound, enslaved to a hunger older than kingship itself. There were attempts to break the pact. Generations of rulers summoned priests to perform exorcisms, flooding the palace with incense, chanting, and sacred water. Others turned to darker methods, consulting alchemists and occultists, offering sacrifices of animals, even humans, in hopes of redirecting the curse. But the hunger could not be appeased. Every attempt failed, and each failure only deepened the fear that the pact could never be undone. Some chroniclers noted that the bloodline itself resisted salvation, as though the very veins of the family were locked in chains too strong for prayer or ritual to sever. Legends told of one king who tried to outwit the pact by denying it heirs altogether. He refused to marry, refused to father children, believing that if no heirs were born, the curse would starve. For a time the palace grew quiet. Yet the dynasty's advisors panicked at the thought of succession without heirs, forced him into union. Within years children were born, and one by one, the cycle resumed. Some whispered that even his refusal had been orchestrated by the curse, a cruel trick to deepen the dynasty's desperation. Another tale described a queen who sought to undo the pact by finding the cavern where it had first been made. She descended with torches and priests, her steps echoing against walls that seemed to breathe. When she reached the stone said to hold the blood of her ancestor, she pressed her own palm against it, offering her life in exchange for the freedom of her children. The cavern was silent. Hours later she was found lifeless, her body untouched, but her face frozen in a scream that no one could explain. The curse remained unbroken. The possibility that the pact was real grew into obsession among both rulers and the people. Some saw it as proof that the dynasty's power was illegitimate, stolen through dealings with darkness. Others believed it meant the family was chosen, marked by forces too great for ordinary men to comprehend. There were even cults among the common folk who revered the bloodline not as victims, but as priests of a greater hunger. They believed that each devoured child was an offering that kept the world itself from collapsing into chaos. To them, the dynasty's suffering was not tragedy, but necessity. What made the tale of the pact endure was its inevitability. If true, then the bloodline's doom was not a matter of fate, but of choice, a choice made by their ancestor in pursuit of power. Every poisoned goblet, every vanished child, every whisper in the walls was not random misfortune, but the precise fulfillment of a bargain signed in blood. And if the pact remained unbroken, then the dynasty could never escape. No matter how many times they tried to cleanse their halls or deny the curse, they were bound to the hunger they themselves had unleashed. Scholars debate whether such a pact could truly exist. Yet even skeptics admit that the dynasty's history reads less like the chronicle of a kingdom and more like the script of a haunting. Too many deaths, too many coincidences, too much despair woven through every generation. Whether superstition or reality, the belief in the pact was as powerful as the pact itself. It shaped decisions, fueled paranoia, and carved the destiny of a family that seemed incapable of escaping its own shadow. And so the story of the unholy pact became inseparable from the dynasty's identity. They were not simply kings and queens, mothers and fathers. They were debtors in an endless transaction with forces unseen. Their children were not heirs but currency, offered again and again to pay for a crown purchased centuries ago. Each cradle rocked in the palace carried not just a baby, but the weight of a bargain written in blood, one that no prayer, no sword, no crown could undo. The story of the dynasty's final heir begins not with triumph, but with silence. By the time this child was born, the palace was already half empty, corridors echoing with absence rather than laughter. Years of death, whispers, and disappearances had reduced the once proud court into a hollow shell of itself. Ministers rarely spoke above a whisper, servants avoided certain wings of the palace altogether, and entire rooms were locked and sealed, as though shutting doors could contain centuries of blood-soaked secrets. The last heir arrived into this world, not as a symbol of hope, but as a reminder of doom. From the moment of birth, the child was treated differently. Priests hovered over the cradle, chanting protective verses in endless cycles, while guards stationed themselves outside the nursery as though steel could fend off a curse. Every night, the queen sat by the child's side, her eyes red from sleeplessness, watching for the slightest flicker of shadows that might mean the curse had come to collect. The midwives whispered that the baby rarely cried, that it lay too still, staring at corners where no one else saw movement. Some swore the infant laughed in the dark, not at toys or faces, but at something unseen that only it could behold. The dynasty pinned all their hopes upon this one fragile life. Scholars gathered forgotten manuscripts, priests prepared rituals never before attempted, and even alchemists were summoned in desperate secrecy. They believed that if this child could survive, the curse might finally be broken. Yet as the child grew, signs of the hunger returned. Pets vanished from the nursery. Servants were found pale and trembling, swearing they felt something gnawing at their very souls, while within the child's presence. At night, the palace echoed with muffled screams, though no source could ever be identified. The air thickened with fear, and each passing year seemed to tighten the noose around the bloodline's neck. The king, broken by years of loss, began to unravel. He forbade anyone from speaking of the curse in his presence, threatening execution for even a whisper of the word. He clung to the child as though force of will could save it, parading the heir through public ceremonies as proof the dynasty still stood. Yet even the people could see the truth. The boy's face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, as though something inside him devoured the very essence of his being. Rumors spread that he was not heir, but host, a vessel carrying the hunger that had haunted the family for centuries. The queen, in her desperation, turned to measures that blurred the line between love and madness. She forbade the child to eat ordinary food, fearing poison, and instead fed him only what priests had blessed or alchemists had crafted. She never left his side, her body wasting away as she poured every ounce of her strength into protecting him. Servants whispered that she slept in his chamber, often waking in terror to find him standing by her bedside, watching her with unblinking eyes. Some claimed she begged him to let her bear his suffering, to take her instead. Others claimed she feared him more than the curse itself, but could never bring herself to admit it. As the child reached adolescence, the palace grew darker still. Mirrors cracked without cause, tapestries rotted overnight, and even the gardens withered as though the soil itself had grown afraid. Birds refused to nest near the palace walls. Courtiers fled, leaving only a skeleton of a court to serve a king too broken to rule, and a queen too consumed by terror to see beyond her son. The heir himself changed. He grew tall but thin, his voice carrying an unnatural resonance that unsettled even seasoned warriors. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words seemed to echo truths no one had ever told him. Ministers trembled when he looked at them, convinced he could see every sin they had hidden. It was then that prophecies began to circulate. Some said the child would be the last, that the dynasty would end with him in fire and ruin. Others whispered he would devour not just his family, but the entire kingdom, becoming the curse incarnate. The people divided into camps, those who prayed for his survival, and those who prayed for his death. The air in the city grew heavy, as though all who lived under the shadow of the crown could feel the end drawing near. One night, according to chronicles both official and forbidden, the heir vanished. Guards claimed he walked calmly through locked gates without forcing them open. Servants swore they heard the sound of many footsteps, though only one boy had passed. The queen collapsed into hysterics, while the king declared that no one was to speak of the disappearance. Search parties scoured the kingdom, but no trace was ever found. Some claimed he had been taken by the curse, claimed at last as the final offering. Others believed he had become the curse itself, wandering the earth in eternal hunger. What followed was chaos. The king, bereft of his only son, died within weeks, his body wasted away as though he had been drained from within. The queen locked herself in the nursery, refusing food, refusing light, speaking only to shadows until she too wasted away. The court disintegrated, rivals seized power, and the dynasty that had once ruled with iron grip collapsed into dust. The curse had done what war and famine never could. It devoured not just children, but the very idea of the bloodline itself. And yet, the legend of the last heir refused to die. For centuries afterward, villagers claimed to see a pale figure walking at dusk, eyes hollow, mouth whispering of hunger. Some said he appeared before families whose children would soon die, a harbinger of loss. Others claimed he slipped into cradles at night, his cold hands brushing against newborn skin, marking them for death. Whether ghost, demon, or boy who had simply vanished into shadow, the heir lived on in story. He was the embodiment of the dynasty's curse, proof that some bargains could never be broken. In the end, the dynasty's final chapter was not written in coronations or conquests, but in silence and absence. The heir left no throne, no crown, no kingdom behind him. Only a trail of whispers, fear, and stories that grew darker with every retelling. To this day, parents hush unruly children, with tales of the boy who ate his family, who was cursed to devour his own blood, and who still wanders in search of what the pact demands: more children, more heirs, more life to consume. The dynasty was gone, but the hunger endured. The collapse of the dynasty did not end the curse. If anything, it gave it a second life, untethered from the walls of the palace and set loose into the imagination of the people. Long after the bloodline was extinguished, the curse lingered as story, as warning, as presence. Historians recorded the dynasty's downfall with sterile words: succession crisis, dynastic extinction, civil unrest. But among the people, the memory lived in whispers of children devoured, of heirs lost to hunger that could never be satisfied. In the villages that once paid taxes to the dynasty, old women told children to stay indoors after nightfall, lest the last heir return to claim them. Candles burned longer, doors were bolted tighter, and lullabies carried verses that were as much protection spells as songs. The legacy of the curse spread in three ways: through fear, through folklore, and through fascination. Fear took root in the generations that immediately followed. Farmers refused to till soil near the ruins of the palace, claiming the ground was poisoned by centuries of blood. Travelers avoided the old royal roads, preferring longer paths through wilderness, rather than risk hearing the cries said to echo along abandoned walls. Even kings who succeeded in ruling the fractured lands steered clear of the dynasty's memory, refusing to rebuild the palace or claim its symbols. To them, the bloodline was not just dead. It was contagious, a sickness no new ruler dared touch. Folklore transformed the story into something more fluid, less bound by fact. In one version, the curse was a punishment from the heavens for the dynasty's pride, proof that no mortal family could raise itself above the gods. In another, it was not punishment but duty. The dynasty had been chosen as keepers of a hunger that kept worse horrors at bay, their children's sacrifices so that the rest of the world might live. In some villages, the tale shifted into morality play, warning against greed and ambition. Take too much, and your children will be taken from you. The image of children devoured by their own parents became symbolic, a metaphor for families that destroyed themselves in pursuit of power. Yet fascination persisted, especially among scholars, mystics, and the curious. The idea that a pact had once been made, binding flesh to shadow, was too irresistible to discard. Secret societies claimed descent from the dynasty, wearing amulets said to be fragments of the cursed crown. Occultists searched for the cavern where the founding king had spilled his blood, believing it might still hold the key to power or destruction. Even poets found inspiration, painting the last heir as tragic figure, damned not for his sins but for those of his ancestors, doomed to hunger forever for something he never chose. The dynasty's name became taboo in polite circles, yet it flourished in the underground. Plays were staged in hidden courtyards, retelling the story of the queen who begged the curse to take her instead of her son. Ballads were sung in hushed tones about the prince who walked through locked gates and never returned. These retellings changed details, blurred timelines, but always returned to the same center, the image of children devoured, innocence destroyed by the very blood that should have protected it. That image, more than any crown or sword, became the dynasty's true legacy. Generations later, ruins of the palace still stood, half swallowed by vines and earth. Travelers wrote of windows that glowed faintly at night, of voices echoing when no wind stirred. Children dared each other to approach the gates, only to run screaming at the first crack of stone beneath their feet. Archaeologists who tried to dig among the ruins reported broken tools, sudden sickness, or nightmares that plagued them long after they left. Some refused to return, swearing that the air itself pressed upon their lungs as if something unseen still guarded the place. Over time, the curse became less a story about one family and more about the dangers of ambition itself. Kings invoked it when warning heirs against pride. Priests cited it in sermons, claiming that no power, no crown, no empire was worth the loss of a child's laughter. Even commoners used it as proverb, "Do not build a palace, or you will feed it your children." The dynasty may have perished, but its story survived because it carried meaning. It gave shape to fears of hunger, of betrayal, of family turned against itself. It became the ultimate nightmare, the devouring of one's own blood. And yet, for all its warnings, the legacy of the curse also tempted. Some rulers secretly sought out remnants of the dynasty's law, believing they might harness the same pact for their own power. They whispered that if one bloodline could command such a throne at such a cost, then perhaps another could too, if only they were willing to pay. In this way, the curse endured not just as shadow, but as temptation, a flame that drew the desperate, the ambitious, and the damned. Thus, the dynasty's true legacy was neither crown nor kingdom, neither palace nor name. It was a question that haunted generations. What would you give for power? And if the price was your own blood, your own children, would you still take the bargain? The curse, once confined to a single family, spread to all who heard the story, forcing them to confront the hunger that lives in every human heart. When the last echoes of the dynasty faded, what remained was not triumph or tragedy, but silence. The kind of silence that lingers in places where too much has been lost, where walls remember more than they should. The palace, once a living organism of laughter, music, and ritual, became a mausoleum. Stones shifted, roofs collapsed, vines crept through broken windows, but no voice rose to fill the emptiness. Travelers who passed near its ruins spoke of an oppressive quiet, a stillness so complete it felt unnatural, as if sound itself had been devoured along with the bloodline. The silence carried its own weight, a final inheritance more haunting than any scream. In it, the people heard what they feared most, that nothing remained, no redemption, no closure. The dynasty's line was severed, its history left unfinished, its halls echoing with unanswered questions. Was the curse broken when the last heir vanished, or did it slip free of the palace, wandering unseen? No one could say, and the absence of an answer became its own torment. Even generations later, when children dared each other to approach the ruins, they returned pale, swearing that the silence was alive, pressing against their ears, filling their chests, until they could barely breathe. In villages surrounding the ruins, silence became ritual. Bells that once rang at dawn and dusk were left unused, their ropes cut, their tones muted. Families refused to sing at night, afraid that song would draw the hunger back. Even weddings and festivals were subdued, as though joy itself was dangerous in the shadow of the curse. The people began to treat sound with suspicion, fearing that to break the silence was to awaken what lay dormant. For some, the silence was proof that the dynasty's punishment had finally run its course. The absence of cries, whispers, and screams meant the hunger was satisfied. For others, it was the most terrifying sign of all, that the curse had no need to announce itself, that it watched and waited in stillness until new bloodlines rose arrogant enough to tempt it again. In that way, the silence became not an ending but a warning, stretching across centuries to remind the living of what had once been lost. The ruins grew into a place of pilgrimage, not officially sanctioned but deeply felt. Mothers brought offerings of bread and milk, leaving them at the gates, in hopes of keeping their children safe. Priests prayed at the shattered altar, though they never stayed long, unnerved by how their chants seemed swallowed before the words could rise. Wanderers left tokens, rings, locks of hair, carved toys, as though appeasing a presence they could not see. None spoke loudly. To do so felt sacrilegious, as though raising one's voice would shatter the delicate balance between the living and the shadows that remained. And in the deepest corners of the ruins, some swore they heard more than silence. A faint rustle, a sigh, the sound of small footsteps retreating into darkness. Parents who lost children too young claimed their voices joined the palace's hush, that the silence was not emptiness at all but fullness, heavy with souls devoured across centuries. To them, the quiet was not void but presence, an eternal gathering of those taken too soon.